I'm very honored to be here, and thank you to Mohammed for organizing. And thank you so much to Dr. Belfer and to Anders for their remarks. I am, in fact, also a lawyer and the national security one at that. So I can commiserate with Dr. Belfer a little bit, but I would also like to slightly disagree with him. Uh, I think I think being a professional in the field of security is what allows to tackle the issues that then can result in the positive trade-off that Anders mentioned, whether to focus on weapons or whether to focus on education. And in some ways, the field of security is not just about weapons, it's just as much about education. And this is what I'm going to address here. We are in the midst of amazing opportunities for cooperation between Western countries and Middle East, between governments and governments, but also governments and people, and people and people. We've had obstacles, we've had challenges, and we certainly have differences in laws. But these differences, there are many ways to overcome them, and we're seeing increasingly that that our countries are finding paths towards greater cooperation. I will focus in my remarks on the United States and its opportunities for countering extremism in conjunction with the Arab states. There's been a couple of specific developments that I will focus on. One is the recent designation of Ansar Allah, or also known to many people as the Houthis, as a foreign terrorist organization by the United States government. That indicates that there is going to be a freezing of the funding for this organization, and its members will not be able to travel to the United States. They're basically persona non grata. That's an important development for a couple of reasons. Not only is the United States acknowledging that this particular group of people has engaged in acts of terrorism against civilians, and that their methods and approaches are not welcome and are not constructive, but that the United States is actually taking action to recognize that, and that it is taking an opportunity to actively contribute to the fight against the sort of methods and ideologies that are wreaking havoc not just in Yemen, where this group is based, but all over the region increasingly. They present a danger to international trade, and when that happens, it's a global danger. It's a danger to prosperity around the world and not just to the Middle East. So what are the actionable steps to promote that cooperation? There are concerns that for political reasons, these sanctions may not be enforced in the future. The reality is enforcement of sanctions is just as much about education and cooperation on a non-political legal level as it is about political decision making and political will. If you want to have political will, you start with education. You start with informing the voters, the American citizens, and citizens later on in other countries why this approach is important, why this organization is similar to Hezbollah, with which it is aligned, and which is receives complete recognition from all administrations and all members of Congress as a terrorist organization. You start by informing the people and the governments about their actions. So the U.S. government did provide that overview in its designation, but it's up to now a new partnership, the partnership between the U.S. and the Arab states, to continue working together to identify entities that are connected to Ansar Allah for defunding, but also to continue working together to educate the public about why this needs to happen, why this is an obstacle to prosperity, why this organization is a major diverter of humanitarian aid, why designating it as a terrorist organization will not hurt Yemenis and others in the region, but in fact will allow for greater and more effective humanitarian efforts. One should raise the questions. Saudi Arabia alone has contributed $16 billion to Yemen over the last 5 years. The United States has contributed over $600 million in humanitarian aid and has had to cut it because all that aid that was supposed to go to the people of Yemen was diverted by Ansar Allah. This is the information that does not get to the public. Educational efforts must be spent. Right now, the discourse in the United States has been dominated by entities associated with Ansar Allah. This designation will allow investigation of these entities and their domination of the public discourse and narrative on this issue, but this is where joint investment of efforts needs to come in. The second issue, the second recent development is the announcement in November 2020 by a major body of Islamic scholars in Saudi Arabia that Muslim Brotherhood is in fact a terrorist organization. Now, in some ways, this is not new because Muslim Brotherhood has been outlawed in Saudi Arabia and a number of other Arab states for a number of years. What this development brings to the table is an acknowledgement of the religious body that this movement has no ideological justification in Islam, and sends a message to Muslim communities around the world that they should be cooperating with the local authorities in the sense of identifying ideological and financial facilitators of this movement and actively assisting them. We know that in a number of Western countries, including and especially the United States, Muslim Brotherhood entities have established front organizations that are supposed to engage in humanitarian, educational, and legal efforts. They claim to be defending civil rights of Muslims in these societies. They claim to be representing the voices of very diverse and successful Muslim communities in the United States without necessarily being asked to do so. And at the same time, they facilitate ideologies that incite divisions and hatred, promote biases, and shut down the platforms of those Muslims who disagree with that discourse. That is not acceptable. They stand in the way of diversity, dialogue, and prosperity, both in the West and in the Middle East, and they facilitate organizations that have been involved in sponsoring terror and organizing terror extremism and violent efforts. Now, on the part of the United States, designating this movement as a terrorist organization has been an obstacle because of the differences in laws between the US and Middle Eastern countries. In the US, designating a terrorist organization means that the organization has been actively involved in planning and carrying out acts of violence, or at the very least played an active part in conspiracies involving violence. There's been some debate over Muslim Brotherhood because it has been promoted as an aggressors movement that has, in fact, to some capacity, funded other terrorist organizations. It has also been noted that many of its members have joined terrorist organizations that had their ideological roots in Muslim Brotherhood, but there's been a point of debate whether being a member of Muslim Brotherhood who then goes on to commit terrorist attacks in the name of some other entity constitutes this organization's participation in that sort of legal conspiracy. There's also been concern over the fact of punishing so-called thought crimes, whether a membership in some extreme movement by itself is sufficient to consider such a person a terrorist. However, this debate has become increasingly moot as evidence has come forward of Muslim Brotherhood's history of direct violence from its ideological roots, as well as its recent funding and active participation in attempted violent attacks in several African countries, including Egypt and Sudan. This additional evidence has allowed people like Senator Cruz to move forward with once again trying to push a bill that would designate this organization as a terrorist organization, or rather push the US administration to do so. What's needed in terms of making something like that possible? First of all, cooperation. It's not enough for Arab states to say Muslim Brotherhood is bad, it needs to be banned, it's terrorist. They need to be providing financial evidence of its sponsorship of terrorism and of its members' involvement in what constitutes conspiracies under the U.S. law, and they should be providing that information to the offices involved in pushing these legislative measures. They should be also working together with both government and non-governmental private entities in identifying participant and financial funding that goes on towards these operations. And there's a lot that has not yet been identified. There are many money laundering methods that have yet to be uncovered. I have recently spoken about the increasing use of private companies rather than Islamic banking or charitable organizations as a method of laundering money towards terrorist causes by these organizations and by members who are actively involved in facilitating terror through acts that would be considered a conspiracy under US law, meaning even if they are not themselves violent participants, they engage in actions that further the conspiracy and result in terrorist activity. But all of that is also not going to go very far without an educational effort. At the end of the day, there's nothing more powerful than a war of ideology, than the war of counter narratives. The United States has not been very good at providing a counter narrative to the power of the Muslim Brotherhood or other extremist ideology narratives, and that is something for us to work on. In the Middle East, we are seeing the kind of reforms that are resulting in increasing number of people leaving these ideologies voluntarily. They are becoming discredited not only through tough law enforcement mechanisms, but because people are becoming disillusioned by the massive propaganda, corruption, and lack of delivery, as well as the violent inciting rhetoric that ultimately contributes to disintegration of societies. By contrast, measures taken by at least several of the Middle Eastern governments in recent years have provided a path to prosperity, security, increasing freedoms in choices in one's country, career and life options, things that and peace in the region. These stand in stark contrast to the path that Muslim Brotherhood and other similar organizations are pursuing, and that serves as a very powerful deterrent and a very powerful factor in encouraging people to make better choices on their own, and not just due to fear of punishment from the law enforcement. This is the United States has in a way lost the plot on this. We have not been able to address ideological roots behind the financing and all these operations. If you do not engage in educational, informational efforts, you are going to be outplayed. And this is where these societies have something to teach us. This is something where we can work together on promoting educational and humanitarian projects, work with Muslim communities in the US, work with the religious communities in the US, with the religious societies on a private, not just governmental level, with private NGOs, with companies, with the organizations, to make sure that humanitarian and educational efforts are not dominated by extreme voices. I believe that this is actually the future that is positive and not just depressing, because it doesn't just combat bad ideas, but actively promotes good ones to speak to others, others' point. Earlier, we can be active participants in the marketplace of ideas, not just by responding defensively to what someone else has introduced, but by affirmatively calling for action through these better ideas. And this is where I believe the future is very promising. Thank you very much.